and get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and we are really lucky to have Professor Shiv Ganesh with us. Shiv is a long-time friend and an amazing scholar, as you will see in his talk, and so we are really privileged that he happened to stop by in Singapore on his way to trekking in Sikkim.
That's right.
That's right. And Shiv publishes and conducts research in the area of civil society organizing and activism, technologies and globalization politics. He is the editor of Journal of International and Intercultural Communication, and I'm sure you will have amazing insights to gain from him about the publishing process if you ask him questions. And most importantly, Shiv right now is with Waikato, but he's moving as a professor of communication to Massey University in New Zealand. So Shiv, welcome. Your first, we sort of framed your broad talk as community resilience, social justice activism, and the new dialogic, and you're going to do 2 presentations, so we're looking forward to it.
Good, are you sure you're looking forward to it? It's going to be a long day. Well, thank you all of you for giving up your long weekend and being here to listen to me. And thank you especially to Mohan and the Care Center here for hosting me and giving me this. I always take my talk seriously and try and prepare. Sometimes I over-prepare, as you can see from about 20 pages of notes that I have. But I really enjoy talking about my work, and I relish these opportunities. So thanks for being here. I'm delighted to be doing this. So I should actually, before I begin, a lot of what I'm saying has sort of been funded research, and I should acknowledge the Marsden Foundation, the Royal Society of New Zealand, for funding a large part of what I'm going to be saying today, and for actually enabling this presentation. So I don't know how many of you got to see the abstracts or the brief blurb of the talk, but in it what I was trying to do was create some kind of logic behind that sort of underlies both the talks. And I just talk about that for just a brief second, just so that there's some kind of discursive connection between what we do in the morning and what we do in the afternoon. What I find really interesting is that in the last 10 or 15 years, scholarly interest has been reinvigorated in social movement and community organizing. And that's because it's been largely a reaction to what I see as several sort of structural and discursive transformations in civil society, globally speaking. And several of those transformations are really iconic and really visible. So you can point to any number of protests over the last year, ranging from the Arab Spring and starting with the battle in Seattle, the lawyers' movement in Pakistan, the overthrow of President Musharraf as a result of that. All these really iconic, highly visible protests are in a sense only part of a broader, I'm going to use the word transformation very tentatively, although I think we'll problematize that as we go through the presentation. We've also seen sort of new ways in which communities are beginning to organize around social problems in less visible but in no less meaningful and impactful ways. So these phenomena, I think, for those of us in communication and media studies, are really, really important to do on several registers. Right? So at one level, they signify, to me, I think, social theory is always playing catch up. So in a sense, I see communication studies as still hopelessly mired in a mid-20th century approach to social theory, a kind of social theory that emphasizes absence, right? So, think about it, back in the, concepts such as hegemony, subalternity, representation, all of these understand justice in terms of its absence, right? And we haven't done a good enough job of theorizing emergence. Whether or not it's in terms of networking, whether or not it's in terms of solidarity, regardless of the vocabulary, I don't think we have evolved enough vocabulary to do that. So continuing to engage with what's going on in the world around us is, I think, the only way we have of actually continuing to develop our theoretical insights, right? So I guess that is what sort of is part of my sort of broader concern, what I hope to move toward, and maybe not just this presentation, not next year, but in the next 10 years. You know, that's what I want to see us do in communication studies, is develop vocabularies of you know, to describe and assess emergence, not just absence. So that said, you know, in the first part of the seminar, what I'm going to do is look at a very specific study that I've done of community resilience and try and understand how that can help us change our notions of locality and community. And in the second half, what I'll do is try and sort of, well, not take a step back, but make some more macro level observations, I guess, about what activism is, what counts as activism, how, you know, what is activist networking, how do we understand the role that digitization and digital technologies play in all of this. So I thought that would be a good session for the afternoon, because that'll get us to sort of reflect and hopefully get us into a more reflective space. So it does work. Okay, so moving on to community resilience, I've called this resistance and renewal in an age of ecological crisis. And you know, that actually is sort of an iconic photograph from Britain of a coal plant that continues to operate in the British Midlands, and it's sort of become this iconic symbol of industrial pollution, which continues to happen despite the virtual world that most of us live in. But currently, I think it is fair to say that, you know, media and our public attention is certainly popularly preoccupied with ecological crises and their global issues and their impacts, the efficacy of global policy initiatives, whether it's in Copenhagen or Cape Town, and increasingly orchestrated institutional conservative resistance to discourse about climate change in the form of climate change denial. And you know, two monumental crises stand out here. One is, of course, climate change, or anthropogenic global warming, as people call it. And the second is the related problem of peak oil, you know, which was a term that was coined by this engineer in the Shell company, of all places, Marion Hubbard, who talks about Hubbard's peak. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. But peak oil is basically this, the term coined in 1956 to describe the moment at which the rate of extraction of petroleum from the earth would finally be overtaken by the rate of consumption, and we've reached that point. You know, so this kind of popular discursive emphasis on crisis is certainly warranted. But what I find interesting about these popular discussions is not just because of their truth value, in which I believe they have, but also what one might call a very novel eschatology. You know, eschatology is sort of a biblical term. It refers to the study of demise, right? The study of the day of judgment, really. So there's an eschatology to these narratives that I think are interesting. So take the plethora of popular apocalyptic commentaries that have emerged in the wake of the global financial crisis that that characterize our contemporary and future world in terms of global collapse and global degeneration. This was actually summarized by Ben McGrath in the New Yorker 2 years ago. He used the word collapsitarian to talk about these narratives, and I love that term, and I've begun to use that in my work myself. And so these books with titles such as Reinventing Collapse, The Long Descent, The Long Emergency, The Collapse of Globalism, represent what I think we can call an interesting shift in, or maybe an interesting post-global shift in popular political culture. Okay, so on one hand, you know, these collapsitarian narratives feature very singular, abstract, and totalizing representations of the world in the form of a singular figure of the globe, you know, and as such, they sort of represent. I don't know how many of you are familiar with sociological studies of globalization, you know, starting from Roland Robertson onwards, but this whole idea of the metonymic reflexivity that globalization affords, where they say that globalization is essentially about global reflexivity. Okay, that is reflexivity that is characterized by the heightened awareness of our contemporary interconnectedness and complexity and the compression of time and space. Right? So in other words, what globalization is all about a global consciousness, even though you operate in local context, and this seems to be a heightened aspect of that. So collapsitarian arguments would add collapse to the list of features associated with contemporary forms of global reflexivity, right? So on the other hand, though, the popularity of the collapsitarians, I think, also indicates a shift, however partial the shift, in contemporary political culture beyond the notion of global reflexivity itself to the emergence of a post-global awareness that the world might be growing larger again. So, so even as the constitutive characteristics of what counts as global start to shift, so does the constitutive characteristics of what counts as local. Okay, and that's the broad goal of this presentation, to understand these micro shifts in location in terms that move beyond our usual consideration of the mutual implication of global and local forces. Right? So my objective then is to consider anew emerging forms of locality in the context of contemporary ecological crises. Okay, so the current preoccupation with collapse, I think, sort of misses the fact that in recent years a groundswell of popular local movements has emerged to act on issues of climate change, peak oil, and overpopulation by trying to transform local civic organizing and local economic organizing. So Curtin refers to these movements as eco-local, and he understands the term eco-localism as a model of place-based economics, okay? A model of economics that emphasizes location and that rejects organizing practices that privilege placeless, rational, global economics. Okay? In other words, it is the privileging of economic decisions made by communities who, critically, understand the vital role that are played by local ecosystems. Okay, so this kind of eco-localism is, of course, rooted in a broader skepticism of large-scale, universal, modern, central change, right? So these specific eco-local initiatives across the world are really diverse, and they range from everything from guerrilla gardening, I don't know if you've heard of that, but illegal gardening in urban spaces, to creating alternative local exchange economies, which I will talk about later today, as well as farmers markets, traffic calming, carpooling. The sheer number of these kinds of eco-local initiatives is quite diverse. And one eco-local movement in particular that has grown globally since 2006 is the popular Transition Towns Initiative, or the Transition Towns movement, more popularly now known as Transition Initiatives. And that was started in Ireland in 2005 by a permaculturist, Rob Hopkins. And it now has more than 500 chapters worldwide. So sort of a really, an incredibly quickly growing social movement. In the last 5 years, it's reached a number of locations everywhere from Portugal to Brazil to New Zealand to Australia, even the United States, believe it or not. So the transition movement is a really good example of an eco-local movement because it emphasizes the need to transit, right, or move out of a high-energy, densely connected industrial economy towards a local, loosely connected, low-energy economy that can more and appropriated by different discourses. However, before I even explain what I see as resilience, let me tell you why I'm dissatisfied with how this term is beginning to be used in organizational communication studies, which is my intellectual home, as well as organizational studies more broadly. So I'm going to start by grousing, and then move on to telling you a bit more about how this concept is evident in the transition initiatives movement. So in communication studies, I think that the term resilience is overly interactional. So I think of Patrice Buzenel's work with her colleagues, who argue for what she calls sort of an explicitly interactional approach to resilience, and saying that the process of communication is central to building resilience with individuals, with communities, with within families. And the notion of reintegration in her perspective is central, right? I mean, like communication can fix things, right? And communication is what makes you stronger. And my problem with an interactional view is that it prevents a more material notion of resilience, which I think is crucial, and I'll get to that a little later. Second, and I guess more interestingly, the concept of resilience in organizational studies is geared overwhelmingly toward adaptation, right? So when you think of what it means to be resilient as an organizational studies scholar, you think of what it might mean to adapt with to a degenerating world, right? To deal with the consequences of things that are going wrong. And it's interesting that studies of resilience are dominated by what they call positive psychology and positive organizational studies. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with positive psychology and its offshoot positive organizational studies, but the basic presumption of this entire cult at the Academy of Management is this notion that as organizational scholars, we have studied problems for far too long. And what we need to do is study positive phenomena and study how communities flourish and study how organizations flourish and so on and so forth. And resilience is a key part of that kind of scholarship. And to me, the focus on adaptation is almost paradoxical in positive scholarship because we're supposed to be looking at thriving and flourishing and newness. But I think that the reason that they focus so much, positive scholarship focuses so much on adaptation in resilience and not on newness or renewal, is because it understands the idea of a threat or risk itself as negative, right? So, and negative things are not to be studied. We study because it studies positive things. So the instant you define the risk as negative, you don't act to change it, right? You just focus on things that you can do to adapt to it. And that's my explanation for why this big body of scholarship focuses so much on resilience as adaptation. And I mean, the positive, and again, I mean, this is a bit of a rant, but the way in which the word resilience is appropriated is increasingly politically sort of conservative and kind of horrifying. So, for example, Martin Seligman, you know, who is the guy who invented positive psychology, is now the consultant for what used to be called the U.S. Army's Battle Mind program. Now, this is a program that trains soldiers to kill people, right, and not feel the devastating psychological effects of killing. Right, hence the term battle mind. Under his advice, they changed the title of that program from Battle Mind to Resilience Training. Right, because that was seen sort of as a positive adaptation to the psychological damage that killing another human being in war can have on you. The Transition Initiatives movement, however, understands resilience very differently. Right? It is such a central organizing concept that it is in the title of the very founding document of the book, the Resilience Handbook. Sorry, the Transition Handbook from All Dependency to Local Resilience. And they talk about resilience as the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change. And it draws from an ecological notion of resistance as evidenced by its association with the Resilience Alliance, which is a European-based consortium of climate scientists that who explore the dynamics of social ecological systems, not just ecological, but social ecological. So that alliance talks about resilience as the amount of change that a system can undergo and still retain similar controls in function and structure, as well as the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization and change. That is a crucial aspect of that kind of systems theoretical view of resilience. And so you can see how this definition positions resilience as distinct from stability, distinct from just adaptation, and is part of an ongoing process of cyclical self-organizing that involves systemic renewal.